Does anybody remember the first videos that I did? I didn't even want to show my face, let alone talk. I hated the sound of my voice, editing it. I used to edit all of the videos on mute. And now I talk too much. This particular project, I think it's going to be a couple different videos because everyone says my videos are getting too long, so I'm going to shorten them. But this particular project is something that I'm really very excited about. When I was working in a quilt shop many years ago, I don't know how many, more than 20, I used to do simple quilts. I started helping teach the vacation kids classes, and then I took over the kids classes. Then I started teaching really simple projects. And one of the ways that I found projects was a publication called American Quilt Retailer. And it only came out maybe 4 times a month, 3 or four times a year. I always looked forward to it because they always gave you a free pattern that the quilt shop was allowed to use to increase their sales. The pattern could not be charged for. You had to give it away for free, but you could sell or give it away with a kit or with a class. And so I saw that first in the little publication the day that it came in, and I waited for all the other teachers to see it. Nobody thought much about it. I was in love with it. What I loved about it is that the back is the mirror image of the front. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. It's called the Lazy Afternoon Quilt, and we have the PDF file for this pattern on our website. It's a free download, and so I would urge you to go and punch in Lazy Afternoon. It will bring up the pattern and you can download it. You could have that and make notes on it as you are watching me do the cutting and as we do the piecing. And then later I'm going to show hopefully 2 or 3 different ways of quilting this up. One of the great things about it is that it uses really large prints, and you're able to see what the fabric is. So I really liked that. I had this on my class schedule when I was teaching. I think I put it on every single class schedule. We would take 12 students because that's the most you could have in the classroom with the sewing machine. If they bought the fabric, I would pre-cut it for them, so when they came in, all they had to do was sit down and sew. The people filled that class every time I taught it, and as I said, I taught it every class schedule, and a lot of the times it was the same students. They took the class over and over because they knew if they took the class, when they went home, they would have the front and back pieced, and we would sandwich the quilts there in the shop with them, and they would have it pinned and ready to go home to take home to quilt. So people would take it. It makes a great gift. It's great for college dorms, and you can make a few adjustments to the pattern to take it from a square pattern to a rectangular pattern, which was perfect for dorm beds. The first one I did was a very large oriental fabric with batik. It was a excuse me. It was a green oriental background with gold koi fish on it. And the print was so large. I mean, the fish was like this big. And it was so big that any other pattern, if you cut it up, you would lose the fish into a million pieces. And when I made this quilt with it, then the fabric sold out. Until then, it was just sitting there because it was just too big to use. So we have the pattern on the website, so go ahead and download your copy. I want to show you, this is a finished quilt of this pattern, and it just looks very much like a simple cable quilt. But when we flip it around to the back, you'll see that it's just reversed. The fabric, the 2 fabrics are reversed. So while this is mostly red with a little bit of the vintage Valentine fabric, the other side is primarily vintage Valentine with the red. Now, if I didn't say it up to now, this is a 2 fabric quilt, but there are certainly ways that you could divide that up if you wanted to do a little bit more of an accent, and I'll show you one that is not quilted yet, and I have the 2 pieces. But I've made many of these myself, and this is the only one that I have left still. The beautiful koi fish I gave away to a friend of mine who was doing yoga classes. He was a really good yoga instructor. So I gifted him with my koi. This is one side of the Oriental quilt that I did. You can see on this one I put in this one strip of gold as the inner border, and that just helped to add a little excitement to it. It's very easy to do this in the cutting instructions, but this is Oriental fabric with a really nice jade batik, and then the other side got stuck. The other side is primarily the jade with the Oriental and then the same accent. So the cutting is the same for both the front and back, because you use the pieces you don't use for the front of one fabric, you use on the back of the other. So there's almost no waste. The fabric requirements are 3 5/8 of 2 fabrics. It's going to be a little bit less if you use an accent color, but I always just used to buy 4 yards of each, just to accommodate any shrinking or if I make one little mistake while cutting. So that is what they look like, and I'm going to show you just a couple options that I have for just color selection. Ever since I was a kid, I always think of my family as roses, and I'll tell you why real quick. My mom grew up in Tennessee, and we had to cross the railroad tracks, follow the railroad tracks to get to where her house was. It wasn't on the side of a road, and we had to cross a trestle to get there. And we went back one time, and all that was left was a little bit of a well and an old briar rose next to the well, and that memory just stuck in my head. So whenever I think of my mom's side of the family, I think of roses. So this is a really great digital print of roses, and I got this more solid fabric to go with that. If you have 2 really busy prints, it could work if you're doing something like cave fabric, but I like a little bit of relief in between the 2. This is just a slightly different version of the same thing. This is actually a different rose than the first one, but it's the same print as that one, but in a different colorway. And so you could see how that kind of would look together. I got this cave fabric that I wanted to try, but I couldn't find anything that would match it except for this brown stripe batik. The problem with directional fabric is we're going to be cutting length of grain and cross grain. So if you have a striped fabric, it's going to interrupt the pattern visually, and so I recommend more of an overall pattern than anything that is directional. You still can do it, it's just not going to give you the same look because the stripes are going to be going different ways on the quilt, especially on the border. And the one that I think I'm actually going to do today, because I wanted to do this as a gift, was this Ohio State Buckeyes fabric with this gray. Neither one of these are directional really, so those should play off well. Before anyone jumps on me, I'm not a huge sports person myself. Obviously, I'm in a quilting room. But I have family who are both Michigan fans, Tennessee fans, and Ohio State. I'm just trying to cross off one of my to-do list with the Ohio State. So don't burn me at the cross if you're not an Ohio State Buckeyes fan. But it would be interesting if you have fans in your house. We would like to hear what team you guys support. Doesn't have to be professional football. It could be hockey or basketball. But you can tell me what your jam is. So I have 4 yards of each of these 2 fabrics. We're going to go upstairs, and today's video we're going to focus on just the cutting and the layering of the fabric to get it ready to sew. I just like to do that for organization reasons. I will tell you, before we go upstairs, has been a lot going on up there in the last couple months. Part of it is we posted 11 new videos last month alone. Creating 11 videos by myself creates a mess. So I'm going to try very carefully to have the camera only focused on the cutting table, because everywhere around the cutting table is going to be chaos. That way you'll be able to focus. I will pin the quilt on the wall behind me so that we can talk about what pieces we're cutting, and I will iron my fabric, and then we will get right to the cutting. And the piecing, I think, is going to be a separate video, but it will go pretty quickly. And then another video or two will be different ways that I quilt these. I'll do one on the long arm machine and one on the domestic machine for sure. So let's get rocking and rolling upstairs, and we'll see how easy this is to cut. Both sides, both colors are going to be cut exactly the same way. It's exactly the same instructions. But me personally, I wouldn't cut them both at the same time, layered. I cut them separate. It takes an extra couple minutes. But I have cut so many of these kits, having taught it so many times, that it goes pretty quick for me. So let's get moving. Okay, we've reduced the scope of the screen, so hopefully the chaos that I'm looking at, you don't have to look at. I took my first piece of fabric and I've ironed it. It's already been washed because I always like to wash my fabric. And I just pressed it. I have the fold away from me. I have the two selvage edges, one on top of the other. This is just the way the fabric comes off the bolt. And that's how we're going to start cutting. The cutting instructions are really very clear on this pattern, and it has all of the parts labeled so that you could see exactly what you're cutting. But I will be telling you also when we start what we're going to be cutting first. And the first thing that we do cut is the outside border. That's one big piece. We're going to cut it at 66 inches in length, and then we're going to open it up and refold it so that it's not folded the way it came off the bolt. It's opened up and folded back on itself like an accordion. And we're going to cut that. Basically, the instructions ask for 10.5 inches in the width. I'll show you that when we get to it. But one thing I will say that I stopped doing was cutting it exactly 10.5 inches. Fabric is shrinking, so sometimes we won't be able to get 10.5 inches. But on some fabric, like a batik, you might be able to get 45 inches. So I just divided the usable fabric by 4 because we need 4 borders. And that way, one of these quilts may be, either the front or back, maybe a little bit bigger than the front, maybe by an inch or 2. And when I long arm it, I use that one as the backing because it's a little bit bigger. But we'll explain that as we go. So the first thing I need to do is make a clean cut at the end. I have the fold away from me. That's not right. I should have the fold near me and the open part away from me. That way, if there's any movement in the fabric as I'm rotary cutting, it has some place to go. That little bit of easement, rather than creating a pucker at the end or a little zigzag cut, it's going to give me a clean cut at both sides. You can see it's been a minute since I've cut anything. I've been so busy filming. I have my fold on a line on the mat so that we have a straight cut. And I'm not working all the way to the end of the table. I'm going to move the fabric. Open my blade. I have the ruler lined up with the lines on the mat, both vertical and horizontal, to make sure I'm getting a perpendicular cut. Holding the mat in place, getting a clean cut, closing the rotary blade, getting rid of my waste. Looks like I moved my garbage can as well. But now I'm going to move the fabric down because I need a 66-inch piece. I know that my mat is 68 inches, so if I go ahead and cut 2 inches from the end, I know I'm getting 66. So this piece here constitutes all 4 borders for one side of the quilt, either the front or the back. Now that I've cut that, I'm going to unfold it. And I'm going to fold it back on itself the length of grain. So the right selvage is overlapping the right selvage, and the left selvage is overlapping the left selvage. And I'm going to fold it twice so I can get it all in the ruler. Making sure it's flat here, as flat as I could get it. Making sure it's even. I'm going to measure this 41, so 10 and a half, 10, 20, 30, 42. I would need 42. So on this piece of fabric, I'm not even going to be able to get the 10 and a half inches. It's not wide enough. The usable part of this fabric is only 41 inches. And that's totally okay. So I think I'm just going to go for 10 inches strips on here, because I'm not going to be able to get the 10 and a half, because I know I have 40. So I'm going to do a fresh cut at the beginning. I'm moving it over to the center of the table so that I can get a clean cut. Open rotary cutter. I've got my ruler lined up with the grid of the table. Now that I have my fresh cut, I'm going to go ahead and give myself 4 10-inch strips. Let's see. This is an 8.5-inch ruler, 8.5, 9, 10, so I need 1.5 inches added. I'm adding 1.5 inches to the front of each one so that my strips are 10 inches. And get rid of my waste. So now I have 4 strips that are 10.5 inches by 66 inches. These are 10 inches by 66. Those are going to be the outside border on either side A or B. And I'll stack those up nice and neat. I'll find my fabric again. And take a minute to get it realigned. Dropped on the floor and made a mess. If I need to, I'll re-straighten this first edge. Technically, they say that you're only on the straight of grain when you cut enough fabric that stayed underneath the ruler you're using. So it is possible, this is an 8.5-inch ruler, it's possible that you may have to trim up that leading edge every 8 inches or so if you're really worried about getting perfectly straight pieces. Now when you get to this phase, what we're going to be cutting is the inside portions. So the first one is the larger one. This large strip is what we're going to be cutting next, and we see we have 4 of those. So we're going to have 4 strips at 7.5 inches. I've got my fold lined up on the line of the mat. And I'm going to do a clean cut at the beginning. Now I know that you can't see the cutting that I'm doing. On this piece I'm going to cut with you back there, and then on the Ohio State fabric I'll pull you in closer so you can actually see the fabric instead of me, or the overview of it. This piece is going to be 7.5, double checking. 7.5, I need 4. I just mushed it up again. So I'll have 7.5 on my ruler. This particular ruler is an 8.5 inch ruler. So we've just done these 4 pieces. I'm going to fold those up again into another pile. The nice thing about this pattern is it has minimal piecing and the pieces are fairly large. So it makes a very forgiving quilt as far as extreme accuracy. That's not as critical on this quilt. So it's a great beginner quilt. It's a great group quilt where you could have multiple people working on it together if you were doing charity quilts or needed to pump out a great number of these. You could have different people do the cutting and the piecing and assembling. So that's really a great thing about this pattern. American Quilt Retailer also is a great magazine for quilt shops because it gave a huge variety of ideas for saving costs, for new business ideas, for equipment, POS machines, and all kinds of things. So it was a great industry magazine. I always loved it for the patterns. Sometimes they were applique, more often or not they were pieced. The next piece we're going to be doing, we need 3 strips, and those are 4.5 inches, and that's these pieces here. So we only need 3, and they're 4.5 inches. And again, I just fold them up into little packets that I could carry easily. Then when I get the other fabric cut, I will mix them together, and that will make it easier to get them to the machine and sew them together in the right formation. I've just moved my fabric. It's still on the flat line here on the fold. I don't necessarily have to have it on one of the lines this way because I have the ruler. As long as the ruler lines on the straight edge, even if I was cutting at an angle on the table, the fabric will be straight. The nice thing about doing that sometimes is we're cutting in different locations on the mat than always on those straight lines, and it actually makes the mat last longer. So the last piece we're doing is we need 5 strips at 2.5 inches. That represents this fabric here. And as I said earlier, you could do a third fabric for those strips for both the front and back, in which case you would need 10 of them because you're using it on both front and back instead of the 5. But it allows you to use a different fabric. But I'm going to follow the pattern exactly today, and we're just going to use the same fabric at 2.5 inches. I'm not worried about trimming off the selvage at this point because I could just align those when I'm sewing and they don't even have to be trimmed off. One, two, three, 4, 5. The nice thing about stacking these up on top of each other also is it's a very quick reference to see if you've cut any of them the wrong direction or the wrong size, because if they're all 2.5 inches they should stack up perfectly on top of each other. Now the piece that you have left over is what they recommend for your binding. Should be 3/4 yard. If you choose to use one of the colors one side or the other. So that is it. This is what we have left over. Again, I'm not sure if I did 3 5/8 or 4 yards of this particular fabric, but this is our leftover. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'll pull the camera in closer for the next group of cutting. But I have to iron it first. I always like to iron and get right to the table. So we'll go ahead and iron, get it folded onto the table, and we'll repeat this whole process one more time and then get our fabric stacked. I made a little cheat sheet if you want to make a note of this. For piece number A, which is the outer border, you need 66 inches of fabric. For piece number B, you need 31 inches. For piece number C, you need 13.5 inches. And for D, which is the inner border, you need 12.5 inches. Now, that's if you want to totally separate everything out and have the front and back completely different. If you're going to do A or your B's and C's together, you'd have to add those together. So you'd have B for the front and C for the back, and vice versa. So it's just a way if you wanted to stretch it out. But the chart on here is very clear to read about which pieces you're doing. The cutting instruction is exact same for fabric A or fabric 1 and fabric 2, or however you want to say that. So all the instructions are really great. Again, this is a free download on the Urban Elements website, but it is courtesy of American Quilt Retailer. I do want to say that. Very gracious of them to allow us to do this. So I already have my fresh cut on the start here. I have the fold of my fabric towards me so the fabric can ease out. I'm going to do my first cut, which is 68 inches. And again, this fabric is folded just the way it came off of the bolt. Now I'm going to unfold this piece and fold it back in the opposite direction. So it's now folded lengthwise, and that way I can get my 4 strips for the border. And ultimately what I'm doing is cutting the border in 4 equal pieces. Now with the change in fabric over the years, because this pattern's at least 20 years old, the fabric width has changed. So basically, if you don't have 10.5, you're just going to divide the width of fabric into 4 equal pieces. And you don't even have to trim this selvage off. What you could do is leave the selvage on, and when you're piecing this border onto the quilt, just have this be at the very outside edge, not your inner seam. And you could use this extra bit of fabric for getting it loaded onto the quilt frame, and then you can always trim it down later. So you don't have to cut that selvage off. Get it nice and flat. Let's see what we're really just going to be at 10 inches again. So I'm not even going to trim off the straight edge to clean it up. I'm just going to cut it into 10s. Again, this is an 8.5 inch ruler, so I'm adding 1.5 inches to the front. Adding 1.5 inches, adding 1.5 inches, when I'm adding 1.5 inches to the front of the ruler, I do have to have these straight so I could use the mat to give me my extra 1.5 inches. But when I am doing smaller pieces, then I don't need it to be flat on the lines, and I could save my mat a little bit from that. So the next piece we're going to do, I'm going to straighten out this whole length now. Be amazing to have like a 4-yard cutting table. So you'll see now that I don't have my line on a line here. I'm just going to solely use the ruler. I will give it a clean cut at the start because I can see it's off by about 1/8 of an inch. So I'll get rid of that. I'm going to do 4 pieces at 7.5 inches. And I'm just lining up my 7.5 right on that clean edge, and the line on my ruler is also on the fold. I need 4 of these. If this is confusing to you, don't do it. It's just a way to stretch the life of the mat a little bit because we're not always cutting exactly on the same lines. So we ended up getting a little bit longer life out of our mat. Cutting mat happened to be one of those things that are kind of a large expense. And so it's nice to stretch the life of it if you can. So that's our 4 pieces at 7.5. I'm going to give myself a clean cut again because the edges are not perfect anymore. And this time we do 3 strips at 4.5 inches. And it's okay if you want to keep going back to your instructions and double checking your sizes. Because you don't want to waste your fabric. And now we have our last strips. The last strips are the 2.5 inch strips, which are the inner border. And on this particular quilt I am doing it just the way the pattern required it. Only 2 fabrics. This is my last strip. My father just passed away last March, and he would have loved this fabric. He would have been all for this Buckeyes, Ohio State. He went to Ohio State, so that's why I think that's why he loved it so much. So we have this piece left over, about 3/4 of a yard. This could be used for the binding or the gray. So I'm going to fold this and put it with the other piece of scrap fabric or binding, whichever it ends up being. And this is how much you would need if you were doing French fold bias binding. So now I'm going to go ahead and shut the iron off and go back downstairs in the clean room and stack these up and show you how I'd get them ready to take to the sewing machine. Does anybody else use their ruler as like a tray to carry all their stuff? I do that all the time. Then I can't find where I put my ruler. So we have all of our pieces cut. We have, this is our scrap fabric. I'll put that aside. Thought I made a mistake. We should have 4 different groups of the 2 different colors if we're doing it the very basic way. I'm going to bring the camera in so you can see how I stack it. This really isn't critical, but this is how I used to do it for my students when I would cut it for them, and they could literally come into class, set up their machine, and just pick up the pieces and start sewing. I have my 2 leftovers. I'm just going to put those aside. The borders are all going to be used, all of them at once on one side and all of them for the other. So those 2 I could just stack and put aside. But these 2 groupings get mixed. And so this is how I would mix it. I would take the large and then the contrast, and I would just alternate these like this. And then this whole unit can just go to the sewing machine. At the same time, you could take this grouping, and when you do this, basically you could just chain piece the two groups, cut and chain piece and cut, and do that. These are all the inner borders. So if you wanted to, you could go ahead and just join these end to end, all the gray and then all the contrast. And then when you go to add them to the quilt, you can just measure and cut them as you need them, because you are going to have to piece these. That's why there's 5 instead of 4. So these two we could take to the machine and chain piece those into long chains, and then these units could also be chain pieced in groupings. So again, I can take those and put them on my ruler, and then I can carry this right to my machine, and I'm ready to sew. The outer border and the scrap we could just put aside because we have a little bit of work to do before we get there. I didn't bring my pattern back downstairs, but the name of the pattern is The Lazy Afternoon. It's available for free download on the Urban Elements website. If you just type in Lazy Afternoon in the search engine on the website, it will pull that pattern up. This is all I'm going to do for this video because they say I'm making the videos too long. So this cutting portion will be first. You could go ahead and in the meantime, if you don't have the fabric, you could go out and pick some up. It's 3 5/8 yards of 2 different fabrics. 2 fabrics is all that's required. You could add a 3 if you wanted a contrast for that inner border. I always wash my fabric. You don't have to. I always iron my fabric just before I cut it, and you can see how I have it layered, ready to go to the machine, and it'll be very quick to get these put together. It's a really fun project. I have a lot of memories of making these, of gifting them, and of all the students that took them sometimes over and over again because they knew they would get a quilt pieced and ready to quilt by the time they left class. So we have a lot of memories. For fabric choices, you could either do contrast and value, but one of the fabrics is really great if you have a really large print. If you use really small prints on this, it's not going to be as dynamic. Go bold, go for a very large print. You don't have to have both large prints, but at least one of them do a large print. And try and stay away from directional fabrics because it will interfere with the visual impact of the quilt. So overall patterns work good. Do a contrast between the large print and maybe a medium or small print, or a value difference of light and dark. Remember, color gets all the credit, but value does all the work. The next video for this should be the next video that plays after this one gets aired. That's the way I intend it to go, and unless there's one of our scheduled block of the month type videos. And then also I want to do quilting on the domestic, quilting on the long arm, so there may be a couple different quilting videos on these. I just really hope that it impacts you as much as it has me over the years. It's a really easy quilt to do. All skill levels could do it as a group, as an individual. They make great gifts. They make great dorm quilts. They would be good for people that are going through any kind of rehab in the hospital. It's larger than a little lap quilt, but it would be a very nice cuddle quilt. It's good for kids, teenagers, and adults. It's good for the sofa and the bedroom. So I think it's a really great pattern. I always thought that it was underappreciated in the quilting world because I've never heard of them outside of me teaching them. I'm sure many places taught them and had great success. I just didn't think they took off the way I thought they should because it's such an amazing pattern, being reversible. So next time we'll do the piecing. Thanks for joining me today. Remember, again, in case you missed it last time, check your smoke detector, carbon monoxide detector. Make sure you have functioning, charged fire extinguishers in your quilting studio and in your house. And thanks for stopping in. I look forward to seeing you next time when we're going to get to the machine and piece these together. And until then, go shopping for fabric, take care of yourself, and take care of each other. And let me know what team your family supports. I want to hear some team rumbling. See you next time.